at Incomplete History of Hot, I'm not going to claim to know all the history of Hot or even the part of Hot that I experienced, remember it all, or be able to Google all of it, but this is a start. This is a start. There's a wiki page. So everyone here has a piece of the history of Hot. I'm trying to cover the first 5 years, from 2005 to 2010, which I'll call phase 0, so before anything really started to happen. One piece of advice to everybody: document what you do obsessively, especially when you're getting started with something, when you're not sure it's going to work out, when it doesn't seem important. That's how I am able to remember and find out and put together this presentation. So around this time in 2005, I think there was a lot of us who were operating off of maybe 3 premises and trying to figure out from those basic ideas what we could actually do. It's a human impulse when you see suffering to want to help. And throughout history, usually you want to help people who are nearby to you, people you know well. But of course, today's world, we can see what's going on pretty much anywhere instantly, but there's not a lot you can do for the other side of the globe. But what seemed to be something that we could contribute is technology, is information. And I say it's easy, and it's relatively easy. Almost all other parts of humanitarian response are much, much harder than what we do. And it seemed like this was a problem that we could potentially solve. So 2005, we witnessed the Indian Ocean tsunami. John Crowley yesterday said it took 3 weeks for pixels to get to the ground. Hurricane Katrina. We were watching helplessly while these events unfolded. Hurricane Katrina saw a good amount of interesting work trying to gather imagery that had been collected by NOAA, by NASA, trying to put together a picture of what's going on. People Finder had its roots there. There was a lot of experimentation and a lot of desire to help. I don't know how much impact it had, but we were starting to develop the impulse. And around this time, I used to be obsessed with something called GeoRSS. It's okay that you've never heard of it. I worked on a piece of software called WorldKit. It's also fine that you've never heard of it. And I got connected with a group at the Joint Research Commission at the European Union who were doing tsunami models. So you could simulate, they had a model where you could simulate a tsunami of different magnitudes of the kind that occurred during the Southeast Asian tsunami, and then see the effect, the timing of the wave. And we connected this into WorldKit, and I was then lucky enough, I mean, absolutely no background in this stuff at all, to get invited to the European Union, JRC, in northern Italy to present that work. And while I was there, I presented OpenStreetMap. I had just started working on it, I don't know, a month before. And at that time, this was OpenStreetMap. I don't know if you can see it. This is the only screenshot I've been able to find of like the early first version. Before this, there was just like a search box and a logo and so OpenStreetMap. And the first thing I did was, put the logo here, and we have this map, and there's an edit button, and it kind of looks like Wikipedia. And basically, you have Landsat imagery with like white lines over it. It just was really hokey, and it was a really crazy idea. Nothing worked. And so I was going to people who are doing real work. I think, look at this thing we're doing. Why don't we apply it for disaster response? And I think it's an even crazier idea. And they were very generous to even let me tell them about it, and not too visibly condescending, which I think was good for encouraging to develop the idea. So 2006 was lucky enough to, again, have the generosity of people like Paul Kurian, who had the website humanitarian.info for years, which no longer exists. good for Paul. I guess he thinks it's not needed anymore. John Thompson, Mikel, Graham, the Bright Earth Project, and these are people who had been trying to bridge these worlds of humanitarian response and technology for a number of years, and they were generous enough to start to engage in conversations to educate, well, what are the real needs in a humanitarian response, and how could OpenStreetMap possibly be of service? And really key was meeting Nigel Wolf of Map Action, who now, Map Action, of course, is, I think, a key partner of HOT. And Map Action is just, I think, an incredible organization, just amazing work that they do. And Nigel really spent a lot of time with, maybe it wasn't a lot of time, but it was really valuable into grounding this idea into something real. So by 2007, it started to look like, well, maybe it is real. One event which had no interaction with OpenStreetMap at all, but which was very influential, was a search for Jim Gray. Jim Gray is a well-known computer scientist, and had worked on lots of things, including satellite imagery processing, and he tragically was lost at sea. And a wide effort came together to process satellite imagery out over the Pacific Ocean outside of San Francisco Bay, which was covered by fog. So the same kinds of issues we are now dealing with in Nepal were affecting the search for Jim Gray. The thought being, if they could get updated satellite imagery, and you got a lot of people looking at it through Amazon Mechanical Turk, you might be able to spot his boat. He wasn't found, but it, I think, inspired a lot of people of the power of using satellite imagery and using massive numbers of people to do good work together. And later that year, I met Jesse Robbins, who is described himself at the time as a firefighter and a geek, and he was a master of disaster at Amazon. So his job was to do things like shut down entire data centers and make sure that Amazon.com was still standing. After Hurricane Katrina, he drove down with a lot of people from Burning Man to New Orleans, and as an emergency responder, helped set up relief efforts. And where he set up was pretty close to US Highway 90, which you can see in this proprietary screenshot of Google. This is the bridge there in Google at the time. This was the bridge in reality after it was completely just wiped away by the hurricane. And this was a really intriguing, well, the story goes is a lot of people were still coming to this bridge, driving up, and Jesse was asking, well, why are you showing up here? This bridge is out, who's directing you here? And they said, well, the Red Cross sent us here. And so he called the Red Cross. He got one of the emergency, just a volunteer, I guess, and said, well, I'm looking here at Google Maps right now, and the bridge is there. Are you sure that the bridge is out? He's like, no, I'm really sure. There's no bridge there. They had to go back and forth a few times. Eventually, she was convinced that the bridge was maybe in Google Maps, but not there in reality. So she was convinced, but the other Red Cross volunteers and others were not convinced, so people continued to come. So we have a lot to thank the Red Cross for, including inspiring part of HOT with a very excellent story. And what was, to me, I heard about this story in 2007, and so this is a couple years later. If you routed this is from Yahoo Maps, or Google Maps, or whoever, you would still be routed over that bridge. If the update cycle of information from Navtech and TeleAtlas and the other data providers at the time was many stages and very slow, and still 2 years later, they hadn't gotten the update. But I think after we started talking about it, they did update it. So yay. 2007, a few months later, the problem was that they actually had rebuilt the bridge. So this was then suddenly out of date. This started to get some media coverage. Like I said, they actually did respond, so the idea started to catch on. And at the very first State of the Map, which was in 2007 in Manchester, a group about this size actually got together for the first time, and I presented this idea. And yeah, the title of the talk was OpenStreetMap, a disaster waiting to happen, which is not just referring to the application of OpenStreetMap to disaster response, but to the ever sort of like teetering edge of OpenStreetMap as a community which was really trying to find its feet. I guess I had talked to a lot of humanitarian responders by that time and thought that I kind of knew what was going on, so I started using words like common operating picture. Yeah, I don't know what that means either. But this is the napkin sketch that kind of was trying to bring together a lot of the thinking and discussions. And there's some elements of like what we have going on there. P2P. This is sort of like OpenStreetMap in the center. Remote sensing. That's actually, there's no drones there, but there is a kite. This one, the idea of this is a two-directional arrow of paper maps. So basically, I invented walking paper. Anyway, this is sort of a guidance for. Linkersky's a genius at doing that. Later that year, Skylar Earle and myself went to the FAO in Rome to GeoNetwork open source meeting. We had the first OpenStreetMap mapathon, mapping party. We used to call them mapping parties back then. They were still fun, I guess. At the UN, so at the FAO, you can see there's the banner really badly hung up. I actually think this room was designed, all the rooms at the FAO I think are like sponsored by different, I think it was Nepal, maybe I'm wrong. But there's a picture of Gandhi, maybe there's a we met Nicolas Chavin there, and this was like the first, someone from the UN who was involved in data and GIS who was really became bought into the idea. So 2008, kind of took it on the road. Jesse and myself went to Where2O, O'Reilly Emerging Technologies Conference, and started talking about this story so far. And Skylar and I did the Free Map India 2008 tour. So this was the first, I think, time folks were leaving pubs in Germany and England and trying to go someplace where it might be a little bit harder to do this stuff. And 2008 India is much different than 2015 India, where it's actually pretty easy to do this stuff, and a lot of it is done in India now, of course. Boss just opened an office in Bangalore. But we traveled 8 cities in 1 month, got sick many times, had lots of amazing adventures, got really overly appreciated. Yeah. More. So we were the resource persons. There was awards, there were flowers, there were dancing girls. Literally, it was a really interesting experience. Most of the times things didn't work. Most of the time we didn't have power. We didn't have internet. And this is at research institutions in India. So things have improved quite a bit. Later that year, convinced Chippy, Tim Waters, to himself go someplace else to the Geology conference in Chambéry. I'm also mispronouncing it, sure. And so we were growing. The core of people were growing who were advocating and promoting HOT. And you can play Where's Waldo here with the. If you look at the slides later with a few folks, and Nicholas is there, and Skylar, and myself, and Suha Olgan, who became a real advisor to HOT, was a member. UNGWIG, the UN Geographic Information Working Group, was in this kind of room talking about OpenStreetMap. So 2009 started to see some things happening. After Chippy's presentation, he got connected with folks in Haiti. The data that you saw in Port-au-Prince before the earthquake, the stuff that we added to after the earthquake, was mostly imported by Chippy in the beginning of 2009 from CNIGS. Apparently, somehow they were willing to share that data. And during the same month, we were in the midst of this Gaza crisis, and the attention of the world was on Gaza. I had been working in the West Bank, and we did a mapping of all of the West Bank earlier that year, or the year before. And there's a lot of media reports, and not a lot of picture of like what is actually there. And the thinking was that how can you relate to someplace if you can't even see a map of it, if you can't even see like something that you can relate to in terms of the structure of that place. If you see roads, if you see mosques, if you see supermarkets, markets, then it's a place that's more understandable. And there's just a lot of confusion about what this place is actually like. And in OpenStreetMap at the time, the kind of southwestern part of Gaza was pretty well mapped. Well, not pretty well, it's terribly mapped, but it was mapped a little bit. This part was not, because at the time we had permission from Yahoo to use their imagery before Bing, and you can see the other half. We didn't have imagery. This is a familiar problem to us. But we did not have MapGive, we did not have Mapbox, we did not have Digital Globe releasing all their imagery. We had to buy imagery, and so we learned about imagery resellers and how much it costs per square kilometer. So we decided to purchase all of Gaza, which had been actually imaged after the conflict had started. It's downgraded to 2-meter resolution over Israel. This is kind of a U.S. I don't know. Explain it later, Benson.
No,
Benson cannot explain it.
It's a thing.
It's a thing. And it was cost about £5,000. We did a fundraiser. We raised money to buy the imagery. It was really startling stuff to look at because you could see destruction, you could see military vehicles. And but we got the imagery and we traced it. We remotely mapped all of Gaza. Some interesting things happened, like most of the humanitarian maps which were being published had a kind of road network behind whatever they were trying to show. There's damage assessment and such, and it looked really good. And it was actually, the credit went to the JRC, the European Commission. So I thought, well, maybe we could do an import if they would agree to give us that data. We know them. They were generous enough to not be too condescending back in 2005. So asked if they could release it, they released it. And it was a total man behind the curtain moment because the data was terrible. I mean, no offense to the JRC, but it turned out it had been an intern over the summer tracing probably lower resolution imagery than we had here. And the reality, the match between that road network and the reality was, I don't know, it was just didn't match. And so, the idea that I think there was some discussion of this, Lee said this yesterday, the difference between quality data and good data and authoritative data. Just because it's authoritative doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. So volunteers at this point produced much better data than what was supposedly like the highest standard in terms of humanitarian map making. So we needed a name. Up until this point, I'm really glad we didn't stick with Mappers Without Borders. It would be really awkward now. We'd probably be sued or something. And so of course everyone has to have a good acronym. Every UN agency and responders have a good acronym. So HOT, humanitarian. I think we started with it's a backronym basically. So it's like hot. We can do something with that. Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team in January. And there's the first version of the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team out in the world. This was a conference in Berkeley called The Soul of the New Machine, presented the work in Gaza. And not too long after that, met John Crawley at the first crisis camp, who kind of started walking beside me as we were going to the bar and said, "What would you do with some meter imagery of the entire world?" And I was like, I don't know. What do you mean, some meter imagery of the entire world? Well, it turns out that these conversations, I guess, with NGA about the imagery repository were starting. So in July of that year, went to Camp Roberts, which is an amazing experimental space out in California, and brought together coders like these guys. That's Josh Livney from Google, that's Mike Nagurski, Stamen, Code for America, and some other Google guys. Josh was not with Google at the time. Development Seed was there. I think this picture was taken by Eric Gunderson. And there were people flying UAVs. Todd Huffman showed up with that hard drive full of Eastern Afghanistan, and we processed it in a huge machine. And Google brought this huge server that whirled away for over a day and generated a ton of heat in order to process all of that imagery into tiles. But there was UAV imagery of Camp Roberts, which was kind of a decommissioned army base, and we produced walking papers, and there's some of the walking papers, and I had this USB solar charger just to put it in the picture. We didn't actually use it for okay. In October or so, the first use of OpenStreetMap in a map action produced map, any humanitarian map, there was, as we know well, there was a typhoon in the Philippines, and so that year, Map Action responded. They used OpenStreetMap data. The Philippines community was already very strong at that point. Crisis Mappers conference happened in November, October. There's a lot of, there's Benson, looking a little younger. Andrew Turner, Patrick Meyer. So this is good. This is a good moment. There was a lot of excitement. Of course, this was still a very crazy, crisis mapping of the kind that was being talked about here was mostly still a very crazy idea. And I went from Crisis Mappers, which was in Cleveland, on the way to the airport, went by a Best Buy to pick up some laptops, which was hard because Windows 7 or something was coming out, so on the next day, and I don't know, I got some laptops and went with Erica to start Map Kibera, which I feel like is, really trying to go beyond reaching even educated, technically adept communities to people who are really on the front lines of humanitarian need, know what they need, can contribute to what they need, if only they have the right tools. So that was, I think, also a proving ground for the kind of thing we're all now doing. Missing maps, I think. And this is basically the end of phase 0. Woke up on the way. Don't remember where it was exactly. Basically on the way back to Kenya, kind of reluctantly. Hadn't intended to go beyond 3 weeks, but still going there 5 years later. We were going on the way back. There was an OpenStreetMap Foundation board meeting in Amsterdam, and I was waking up, kind of like this past week, waking up very early in the morning before Erica was awake, and tweeting and trying to, taking part in all of this. So I think that's the end of phase 0. There's a lot more to those 5 years. That's just what I can remember and what I can Google. And I feel like we've kind of come to the second 5 years, like phase one, the growth of HOT from a crazy idea to something which is like essential now, and we'll see what phase two brings for the next 5 years, yet to be written. Thanks. How are we for time? If there's any time, I could do a quick Q&A, or we could split up. What do you say, Blake?
I always say do Q&A, but I'm not
Sure.
a time manager, so.
Let's do some Q&A. If there's any questions.
And Mikel, I mean, that's, Mikel will be around 4 o'clock, right?
We'll do 5 minutes. Or if there's no questions, then.
So where are we phase-wise now? We're at the beginning of...
We're in phase two. Okay.
I want to make sure I make consistent remarks.
It's fine. I mean, it's not because there's 5. It seems to be like 5 years. Phase 0.
If the Red Cross is using it, it's not in beta.
It's definitely not in beta.
It's not.
The Red Cross is no longer causing us problems to solve.
Any question?
I like how you started with your first premise, which was the overwhelming impulse to help. I like how you started with the first premise in the very beginning, the assumption that there's an overwhelming impulse to help when people are suffering. In retrospect, when you now look back at the last few years of activity, to what extent has your understanding of this assumption changed? Or to what extent have you maybe even also added further premises that inform this kind of work?
I'll stick with suffering. One thing is for certain, human nature is not always kind. We know that. So, especially if you are in an emergency situation, of course, usually your heart goes out. When you're in more difficult, more protracted situations, it gets very complicated, and it's harder to overcome your immediate needs. So I think the recognition, especially through Mapcavera, that like the model of open source contribution that we had in mind does not apply in the same way in most of the world, and in fact probably doesn't even apply to us. You know, there's a lot of incentives are key to taking part. Part of it is wanting to do good, for sure, but there's a lot understanding that we all have lots of incentives for what we do is really necessary in order to. You have to look at that realistically in order to work well.
I guess just to piggyback that, the challenge we're struggling with is tapping people's impulse. There's less of that impulse for people to help when they see people who are vulnerable. I mean, I know this is what using maps is trying to highlight, but I think with it just comes back, and this is something I want to talk about later, is like getting a message across, pointing out kind of the value of mapping ahead of time. We obviously have an opportunity to do that with the current response, but it's still a huge challenge, and certainly working in an institution like mine where we are still, I was half paying attention to Mikel's talk because I'm still just emailing people about like what's going on right now and why it's important and why they need to be paying attention.
Priorities.
So that's still a challenge.
Anyone else?
Anyone else?
Please.
Yeah. In phase 0, you talked about, I think you referenced the NGA repository. Was it?
What I mean is
Just the commercial archive.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Benson ended his question.
So I was just curious, like, what is your engagement with NGA or other government agencies in terms of supporting or partnering to support your efforts in the current phase?
Me personally, I'm currently a Presidential Innovation Fellow in the HIU, working on MapGive, so I guess I'm very close. But HOT is, I think, is a partner, key partner in imagery to the crowd. MapGive.
Yeah, essential.
The requesting organization.
Yeah.
For
So, I mean,
for what for determining when there's a humanitarian need and a mapping need that that legitimizes sharing of the imagery for humanitarian purposes.
I mean, we'll get to this later, but the general answer is the relationship with Digital Globe is mediated by NGA because they have the license, the contract with Digital Globe. But as far as sharing imagery under that license to support crowdsourced mapping, we would not have initiated that process or been able to if HOT didn't already exist, because it's still, as you all know, very challenging. There are relatively few formal organizations like the American Red Cross who recognize the value even now of crowdsourced mapping. Or if they do, it's sort of implicit because it's their GIS technicians who are just using the data and the leadership don't understand, or the program managers don't understand. So that was really a necessary precursor.
It certainly does go both ways, though. I mean, since Haiti, I was working as a three-letter agency guy during that time, and it's definitely a two-way street now. There's wide use of OSM on the high side.
Oh yeah, well, and then so
that's been in that trend.
No, I didn't want to go
transition
too long.
those years.
As far as NGA directly, now of course there's a sea change just in the last year or two, and rapidly accelerating in the last 6 months. So we're in a whole new field right now in terms of the two-way flow of information. I mean, everyone has seen NGA's products that, starting with Ebola, that they are using OpenStreetMap as their common base map. There's no question about that.
I'd like to ask about phase 2, it's probably not allowed, but you've obviously seen phase 0 and phase 1, the relationship between HOT and OpenStreetMap and the NGOs changed quite dramatically. What do you see in phase 2?
Yeah, I just think, I don't know if there's like a sea change, but more of just taking it even more professionally and seriously. I mean, if HOT is essential, and if we are that important to partners, then we have a responsibility both to do what we do, which is provide imagery, but also meet them on their level and really understand the constraints that humanitarian organizations work within. I mean, HOT as an organization is a very different form. OpenStreetMap is even different, and HOT really is formed to kind of straddle or to bridge the two. So I don't know. I feel like we know about this. We've learned this, but it's not captured in a way. This was something I was banging on a little bit about during the activation curriculum sprint earlier this week. Just about the importance of managing communications and partners in a way that, if you're in an emergency, like, there's not a lot of time, and you got to understand that, sometimes the way things are done in OpenStreetMap takes a lot of time, so you don't expect MSF to get involved in a tagging discussion, for instance. I mean, unless you want. Should we wrap it up there? Okay.
Schedule, I think we probably should. Oh, okay, oh, absolutely.